In this section, we'll look at the presidency of Warren Harding, which actually wasn't that successful. About his only significant accomplishment was a triumph for conservatives. It was a Ford-Macomber tariff in 1922. Democrats, you recall, had always wanted a lower tariff. They said higher tariffs favored big business. And in fact, Wilson had signed the Underwood tariff with its lower rates. Well, the Ford-Macomber tariff in 1922 had higher rates, especially for chemicals and metal products. They were trying to protect U.S. businesses from new competition from a resurgent Germany. The other thing that Harding did in his presidency was he did bring leaders of the steel industry together and at the White House and got them voluntary to agree to a shorter workday for their workers. Harding had a number of problems, although he always handled himself with dignity. He was unable to command the Republican forces in Congress and really kind of unable to grasp the details of important questions, and thus he kind of remained in a constant state of confusion. Basically, therefore, Congress sort of ran affairs. Harding, most of all, wanted to be loved by everyone, and you can see this when in 1921 he pardoned the socialist Eugene Debs, which I'd mentioned earlier, and been in prison for 3 years. Harding's presidency was mostly known for its scandals. There was no evidence that Harding personally was involved or that he benefited personally, but the people he surrounded himself with were frequently corrupt. Harding confessed to a journalist friend once, quote, "I have no trouble with my enemies, but my friends, they're the ones who keep me up walking the floor at night." Also, you can't really say there was a coordinated system of corruption. It was just continual separate instances. The most famous was the Teapot Dome scandal. Teapot Dome was the name of an oil field in Wyoming that was owned by the federal government, who insisted that the Navy Department keep ownership to keep reserves for any possible future war, at least for conservation. It was, however, sort of a big administrative headache, and plenty of private developers were offering good money to take it off the government's hands. Secretary of Interior Albert Fall, an ex-senator from New Mexico whom Daugherty had recommended, favored private development of natural resources. He didn't share the Democrats' concern for conservation. Fall succeeded in getting authority over the Teapot Dome oil reserves transferred from the Navy Department to his Interior Department. He then leased the land to friends without seeking competitive bids. Fall got approximately $400,000 from these friends, sort of a kickback, at a time when he was in his own financial troubles. News of the non-competitive leases and the kickbacks leaked out, and the Senate formed a special committee to investigate. The committee proved the crime, and the government canceled all the leases. While his friends were acquitted of charges of conspiracy to defraud the government, Fall was convicted of bribery in October 1929. Now, that was several years later, obviously after Harding was no longer president. Daugherty was fined $100,000 and sentenced to a year in prison. After many delays, the former secretary went to jail in July 1931, and he kind of lived the rest of his life in shame. Another scandal took place in the Justice Department. One of Attorney General Daugherty's old friends, Jesse Smith, had come to D.C. with Daugherty and quickly become a sort of a liaison between the Justice Department and the bootleggers of, the income tax evaders and various thugs that were common in the 1920s. Rumors of Jesse Smith's behavior reached Harding, who told Daugherty to fire him. Smith, learning that he was about to be fired, returned to Daugherty's D.C. apartment and committed suicide in May 1923. Of course, a very public suicide really captivated the public's attention, calling more attention to the negative side of Harding's presidency. Another scandal involved the Veterans Administration. The Veterans Administration had been created by Congress in August 1921. Harding had often professed a profound concern for the plight of the veterans and thought his selection of Charles Forbes as director of the Veterans Administration was a good one. He thought the director was a decent, able man. Forbes, however, couldn't resist the temptation to make easy money. He was supervising over millions of dollars to build and run veterans hospitals, and what he ended up doing was skimming money off the side, stealing supplies and selling them, taken bribes for hospital contracts. Overall, Charles Forbes squandered or stole more than $250 million by the time he left office. When word reached Harding about Forbes' activities, Harding didn't want to go public and just let Forbes resign. Word, however, reached the Senate, who began another investigation, ultimately resulting in the suicide of the Veterans Administration's chief legal counsel, an associate of Forbes, after Harding's own death. Again, that was a little bit later. Forbes ultimately convicted of defrauding the government, and he eventually got sentenced to Leavenworth, Kansas in 1925. Harding's scandals eventually even claimed Daugherty. People had suspected Daugherty might be involved in one of these scandals, but they couldn't prove it. When senators raised the possibility of an investigation, Daugherty turned the FBI on them, hoping to incriminate them. Evidence soon leaked out, however, that Daugherty was taking bribes himself in exchange for turning over government property to private hands. Daugherty refused to testify before a Senate Committee of Investigation in March 1924, pleading the Fifth Amendment. Brought to trial in New York in 1926, he again refused to testify, this time saying that his personal relationship with President Harding made it impossible to do so. After deliberating for 3 days, a jury refused to convict Daugherty because it feared Harding's good name was at stake too, although, others involved in the alleged crimes were convicted. Later, after Harding's death, his successor, Calvin Coolidge, forced Daugherty to resign. Harding's ill-fated presidency was ultimately cut short. With all of his troubles, Harding planned a speaking tour of the West, followed by a needed vacation in Alaska. Already suffering from a heart condition and high blood pressure, the long trip across the continent further exhausted Harding. And you got to remember, this was before there was Air Force One. Again, there was like Wilson's long trip across the country. It was exhausting. On August 2nd, 1923, Harding suffered a heart attack in a San Francisco motel room. As his funeral train made its way around the country, millions turned out to pay respects to the man they thought he was. But, as I've noted, soon the full extent of his scandals became known. After his death, word began leaking out about Anne Britton, his mistress, and rumors began that his wife had poisoned him for revenge. But ultimately it was sad. After his death, when the full extent of his scandals became known, people forgot the nice side of his character. Also, after the Depression, people began to blame the 1920s Republican policy and saw Harding's back to normalcy quote as sort of summarizing failed, pitiful policies. This concludes the section on Harding's presidency.